Let's take you back to Jakarta, where protesters have been clashing with police over election results that were announced on Tuesday. Our correspondent Saiful Ismail joins us now from the Indonesian capital. Saiful, we spoke to you a few hours ago when protests hadn't quite escalated. What's been going on since then?
Well, Steve, the situation now at the Election Supervisory Agency has quelled down a little. I do understand there is some negotiations going on between the protesters and the Indonesian authorities. We're not quite sure what the two parties are negotiating about, though. What we do know is that the group of protesters have not dispersed. It's not a big group of protesters. What I can see from the location where I was at about 30 minutes ago is that police are still firing tear gas onto the protesters, and the protesters have in return thrown water bottles, rocks, and also firecrackers. Now, some police personnel are also injured because the protesters have actually picked up the tear gas canisters and thrown it back at the security personnel. So some of these security personnel have also been exposed to these tear gas. If I can share with you the chronology of events leading up to this current chaos in Jakarta. Now, at about 6:20 p.m. Western Indonesian time, protesters were seen dispersing themselves. They left the area outside the Indonesian Election Supervisory Agency in a peaceful and orderly manner. What was also reassuring to see was that some of the protesters waved goodbye to the hundreds of security personnel from the police and military who are on standby to prevent any outbreak of violence, and the security personnel waved back at the protesters. So after what we have seen last night, the chaos and rioting, this is definitely a reassuring sight, but we are not sure what happened after that. Protesters then were seen throwing water bottles and rocks, and all hell broke loose after that. Now, at 5:46 p.m. Western Indonesian time, the protesters stopped their speeches, shouting and singing to observe the Maghrib call to prayers. It was also time for them to break their fast. They consumed their food and conducted mass prayers. Now, by Indonesian law, the protesters have to stop the demonstration and leave the premises and disperse themselves by 6 p.m. local time. Now, if the protesters do not disperse by themselves, the police will have to force them to disperse. The police have given protesters more time beyond the 6 p.m. deadline for them to complete their prayers. The flexibility from the authorities have obviously not been heeded nor appreciated by the protesters, leading to a second night of chaos and clashes in the capital following the results of the presidential election on Tuesday.
Yes, Saiful, we can see the water cannons being put into effect there on our screens as well. And we know that you were out there earlier this evening, as well as yesterday when the protests originally started. Were they worse today? Had things escalated on this second day?
I would say tonight was a little bit more under control, because last night what we saw from the images from the local television network was that security officers was actually chasing these protesters. But tonight, security officers, which consisted of the police and the military, they were more restrained in their actions. They were just firing tear gas onto the protesters, but they were not chasing the protesters in that sense, Steve.
All right, Saiful, you mentioned these negotiations, the scale of the protests from yesterday and today. What do we know about casualties from today?
From today, I'm afraid we're not sure of the casualties from tonight's chaos, but what we do know is that ambulances was actually seen driving away from the area outside the Elections Supervisory Agency. So there definitely has been some people who have been injured by these clashes, either through the tear gas and whatnot. But on the number of casualties from tonight's event, we have to wait and see and get confirmation from the authorities probably tomorrow.
Saiful, the breakout of sort of protests again this evening was somewhat anticipated. Both President Joko Widodo as well as the opposition, Prabowo Subianto, who was running in opposition in the presidential elections against Jokowi, they both came out to make press conferences to say and to call for calm and to call for people to stop the protests. It hasn't seemed to have worked, though.
Yes, it hasn't seemed to have worked, but you know what Joko Widodo and Prabowo Subianto did was actually very important, because it gives a signal to the people that this kind of violence cannot be condoned, and especially Prabowo, because these are the supporters that have been supporting Prabowo Subianto as a presidential candidate, and he has the moral responsibility to actually come out and quell the situation, quell the emotions that has been inflamed by the results announced by the General Elections Commission. So, you know, even though it has not been heeded by these supporters, I think what both of them have done is equally important.
All right, many thanks for that update for us, Saiful. We know you'll be keeping a close eye as things continue to develop in this ongoing story in Jakarta. Our Indonesian correspondent, Saiful Ismail. We're just staying with these images a little bit longer as we're seeing some sort of action take place with the armed forces, their hands raised. There were guns raised just moments ago. It is hard to make out from these images exactly what is going on, but as you can see, there is a large security force on the ground. Smoke is throughout the air. There are fires lit as well on the streets, and protesters are very much on the streets. So the numbers of them are just a handful that we can see on our screen, but from the noise that we can see, we know that there is a lot more going on.
Well, the protesters, Steve, boldly walking straight up to that barricade of security officers formed on the streets of Jakarta. The protests not seeming to stop anytime soon.
Okay, we will return to this story as we get more news that we can bring to you.